The black metal scene is and has always been full of controversy. I already spoke at length about Varg Vikernes' scandals, both before, during, and after his prison stay. A large chunk of that video focuses on Varg's ability to appeal to his fellow musicians, who bend themselves to his worldview and follow his direction in a cult-like fashion. Outside of the Norwegian scene, Hendrik Möbus was one of the most prominent followers of Varg, seemingly mirroring each action Varg took to a level of intensity that Varg could only aspire to. What started out as a group of Black Circle copycats in a small German town resulted in a murder and a political scandal involving two first world governments. This is the absurd story of absurd. Our story starts near the end of the Cold War. At the time, the world was split into two, the capitalist West and the communist East. Hendrik Möbus and Sebastian Schauseil were two teenagers that lived in Sondershausen, a small town in East Germany. Because of the totalitarian regime they lived in, they didn't have open access to foreign music. Any art was heavily controlled and censored by the government, and metal wasn't popular or easily available in their environment. Hendrik and Sebastian resorted to buying Polish and Hungarian heavy metal bootlegs and recording West German radio stations to get the forbidden music they grew to like. They began playing music together for fun, their work resembling 60s punk, featuring lo-fi noisy vocals and heavy distortion. The duo was obsessed with extreme metal, horror, and the occult. It was no surprise that when the Berlin Wall collapsed and they were finally allowed to interact with the Western Bloc, they became aware of the Norwegian black metal scene. Both Hendrik and Sebastian admired the Norwegian scene greatly, with Möbus calling it extreme denial of the Christianized modern world and referring to them as his lifestyle influences. Like many musicians at the time, they decided to emulate the Black Circle. Möbus and Schauseil both became outspoken Satanists, wore all black, and praised Lucifer wherever they could. Their extremity drew in other outcasts, and the duo formed an inner circle that would gather regularly. Their Helvete was an old rock quarry, in which they performed what they referred to as satanic rituals and blood mysticism, with Sebastian as the group's leader. One of these rituals was a baptism ceremony for those who wished to join their inner circle, which included their master, Sebastian Schauseil, cutting the initiate's arm, drinking some of their blood, and licking the knife clean. In addition to these sacrifices to Satan, the group engaged in vandalism that was already the Norwegian scene's standard. They often had wild parties, which sometimes ended in them destroying things while drunk. One famous example included them breaking into a house and smashing everything inside. Not quite church burnings, but the duo were getting there. The strangest element the group adopted from the Black Circle was their form of communication. The Norwegian Black Circle largely communicated through letters. This was a practical choice, as its members were scattered all across Norway, with some of them never even meeting in the flesh. Meetings that required the entire group to be there were non-existent. In contrast, every single person in Sebastian and Hendrik's circle lived in the same small German town and met in person daily. Yet, as a way of mirroring their idols, they would constantly communicate through letters. A lot of the letters weren't even mailed. The members of the circle lived within walking distance of each other, and the sender would frequently carry a letter to the recipient on foot, leaving it in their mailbox. Despite this inner circle though, the vast majority of the people they interacted with despised them, or at the very least could not understand their interests. Their peers ridiculed them, and devoted Christians in the area openly protested their existence. And on the 2nd of January 1992, they officially formed Absurd, the band's name referring to how the average person saw them. The band consisted of Hendrik on drums and Sebastian as the guitarist, bassist, and vocalist. They began rehearsing at a local youth center, where they met Andreas Kirchner. Andreas started as one of the group's initiates, moving further and further up in their inner circle. Eventually, he became the official third member of Absurd, replacing Sebastian on bass. Following Andreas' addition, Absurd decided to finally record some music. They recorded several demos, releasing Eternal Winter and God's Death in 1992, followed up by Death from the Forest and Sadness in 1993. Despite the band's obsessive mirroring of all of the Norwegian Black Circle's actions, their sound didn't change, still sounding like punk and rock against communism above all else. Black metal was a spiritual inspiration to them, never a musical one, despite Absurd calling themselves black metal. While the entire group were fans of the Black Circle, Möbus began worshipping Varg Vikernes specifically. He took a page out of his book, doing interviews with local publications and giving similarly incendiary statements, oftentimes quoting Varg directly. Hendrik would get an article written about them in the weekly Der Spiegel, in which he calls for 30 Satanists to track down and rip the Pope. Even when he wasn't using Varg's words directly, his interviews mimic the way Varg speaks and the things he chooses to say. He openly endorsed Varg's church burnings, referring to them as transformation from music into action. This connection between the man and his idol would start early on, but Möbus' mimicry of Vikernes would only become more egregious as the years went on. The band would try to get the attention of the Norwegian Black Circle, mailing Euronymous a copy of their demos. To their surprise, Euronymous liked their sound, agreeing to release an Absurd album through his label, Death Like Silence Productions. Unfortunately for the trio, this deal never ended up going through. Euronymous' lack of business know-how delayed the process, and his death stopped it completely. While the band was in direct communication with Euronymous, it doesn't seem like any of them ever spoke to Varg, meaning Möbus' obsession with him was entirely parasocial. It seeped further into his everyday life, as Möbus spent more and more time arguing Varg's points with others around him. His arguments with the local Christian youth club resulted in Absurd being kicked out of the youth center they've been rehearsing in. They had to move their rehearsal space to a cottage in the woods built by Hendrik's father, which would become a crucial location for the event that launched Absurd into popularity. Not unlike their Norwegian idols, Sebastian, Hendrik, and Andreas would soon find themselves taking a step beyond quarry blood rituals. Due to their controversial interests and extreme actions, Absurd became a subject of fascination for the people of Sondershausen. This was especially true for young people who felt ostracized by their peers. One of these people was Sandro Bayer, an odd 15-year-old kid who was widely disliked and considered irritating by fellow students. He was a part of the Christian youth club, and became aware of Absurd due to them rehearsing in the same youth center the club operated out of. This awareness soon turned into obsession. Sandro adopted a Satanist look and began trying to befriend the band, regularly asking to attend their rehearsals and even to join Absurd. Möbus openly despised Bayer, constantly insulting him to his face. Sebastian, however, got close to Sandro, even letting him tape music from his collection. Eventually, Sandro realized that he wasn't joining the band and became frustrated with Absurd's rejection of him, his obsession evolving into hate. He threw out all of the black metal and satanic items he bought to fit in and vowed to take revenge on them. Sandro started by spreading unpleasant rumors about the band, often backing them up by saying that he used to be a member of Absurd. His ultimate revenge plan consisted of making a mockery of the band, due to their immense focus on their image. This strategy worked, as Absurd's inner circle quickly began dispersing. Many of its members sided with Sandro and left. With those still remaining, an air of tension was constantly present. The rumors clearly got on the band's nerves, as Hendrik decided to publicly state that Sandro Bayer isn't and never was a member of the band. Privately, Sebastian sent Bayer letters threatening him with sorcery. The fact that they were responding only got Bayer more fired up, which is when he came across a piece of information that would ruin Sebastian and break apart Absurd's inner circle. At the time, the 17-year-old Sebastian Schauseil was having an affair with Heidegrit Goldhart, a significantly older evangelical Christian teacher that was pregnant with his child. Sandro became close to the woman during his short friendship with Sebastian, resulting in her revealing the situation she was in. Sandro started sending letters to Sebastian, warning him that he is aware of the affair and threatening to go public with this information. Unlike the previous mild inconvenience caused by his actions, Bayer now posed a serious risk to Sebastian's life and Absurd's existence. If Bayer followed through with his threats, Sebastian was planning on skipping town with his girlfriend due to the reputational impact the reveal of their secret would cause. Sebastian's image as a Satanist leader would be destroyed once others knew that he was in a relationship with a Christian teacher, and his girlfriend would likely be kicked out of her congregation and possibly fired from her job once others found out that she was having a bastard child with a 17-year-old. Möbus wasn't happy about the situation either. While he wasn't directly implicated in Sebastian's secret, he was aware that Absurd would have to break up in the event that Sebastian leaves Sondershausen. The duo hatched a plan that would get rid of the Sandro situation forever. Posing as a fake girl named Julianne, they delivered him a letter explaining how much she hates Absurd. They proposed a meeting between the two at a World War I memorial deep inside a forest, in order to discuss a plan for destroying the band once and for all. Blinded by his hate, Sandro agreed. And on the 29th of April 1993 at 8 p.m, Sandro arrived to the forest with the goal of meeting Julianne. Instead, he was greeted by Hendrik, Sebastian, and Andreas. After his initial shock passed, the band successfully convinced him to follow them into Möbus' father's shack to discuss an important matter. The group arrived at the shack at 8:30 and ordered Sandro to sit down inside it. As soon as he did, Andreas wrapped an electrical cord around his neck. Sandro tried to scream and run away, but this only caused Hendrik to cut him with a knife several times in an attempt to silence him. While Sandro was pleading for his life, the group tied his hands, held him down, and strangled him to death with the cord. The trio carried Sandro's body to a nearby shack and abandoned it there. Mere hours later, the Bayer family alerted the police, who began looking for their son. The band returned to the scene of the crime on May 1st with the goal of more permanently hiding the body. They wrapped the corpse up in a blanket and buried him in an excavation pit. Möbus and Sebastian were so confident that they were going to get away with Sandro's murder that Sebastian told his girlfriend about it, who then started relaying the story to other people. It wasn't long before the story got to the Bayer family and the local police. About a week after his death, Sandro's body was found, Absurd arrested, and its members charged with murder. Sebastian broke down following their crime, confessing to the murder and giving strange justifications in court, such as saying that it could not have happened any other way and that it was simply inside of them, like a compulsion. He also revealed that he heard the meaningless phrase "Küster Meyer" in his head 6 months before the murder, which he later deciphered as "Töte Bayer" or "Kill Bayer." He took this as a sign pointing him to killing Bayer as the only way out of his situation. The media followed the trials closely. In line with their reporting on the Norwegian Circle's actions, satanic panic kicked in and the entire situation became a scandal far beyond their hometown. The murder was presented as a satanic sacrifice, and all reporting leaned into their satanic persona. Taking Varg's lead, Möbus began to speak to the media extensively, downplaying Sandro's murder by pointing out the number of people that die every single day without a fuss being made about their deaths. He presented himself as extremely apathetic and nihilistic, frequently quoting Varg Vikernes directly in interviews. The media obviously loved this, and shifted their reporting entirely to Hendrik. By the time the trial was over, Hendrik was painted as Sandro's sole murderer and the leader of the local Satanists, despite Sebastian being the inner circle's master and the one that strangled Bayer. All three of them were found guilty of first-degree murder, deprivation of liberty, threats and duress, and bodily injury. As all three were 17 years old, they were tried as minors and given lighter sentences. Sebastian and Hendrik received 8 years in prison each, while Andreas received 6, as the courts deemed him to be an impressionable follower that was manipulated by the other two. With that, their initial spree ended. But there was no way Hendrik was willing to let being in prison stop him from being heard. All three members of Absurd were initially put into the Erfurt prison. They lived on the same floor, interacted daily, and were allowed to keep making music together. Their vacation would be short-lived. Not long into their sentence, their prison was visited by Vera Wallenberger, a member of the German parliament. Shocked at the fact that the three murderers were allowed to hang out while incarcerated, she started a campaign calling for each of them to be put into separate prisons. The Bayer family found out about this and demanded for their holiday to end and their true punishment to start. The campaign was successful and the three killers were separated, which is when each of them took up a different path. For now, both Andreas and Sebastian went silent, but Hendrik went further into the spotlight than ever before. He released an album the band had created in prison, titled THURINGIAN Pagan Madness. Its cover was a photograph of the actual grave of Sandro Bayer, with the text on the inside of the record boasting about Absurd slaying of him. His prison stay also came with the release of Absurd's first full-length album, Fakta Lokuntur, in 1996. Over in Norway, this period saw Varg abandoning his satanic roots and switching over to Norse paganism, before diving into worship of Nazi Germany. Möbus kept mirroring what his idol was doing, he too becoming a devout pagan and claiming that he was never actually a Satanist in the first place. He took his time to study up on Germanic heathenism and Third Reich esoterica, as those became the sole content of every interview he gave from then on. He rambled about how every person's core duty is to serve his ethnic community, called the Norwegian Black Circle the true anti-Jewish resistance, promoted eugenics, spread theories about an ancient Aryan Atlantis, bragged about his Thulian awareness, and more. He called his worldview blood and soil, referencing a Third Reich slogan. He believed that there was organic unity between people of the same kind, and that DNA served as a form of collective consciousness, allowing Europeans to build more advanced civilizations than anyone else. These beliefs might sound familiar. That is because they are the exact things that Varg Vikernes spoke about from prison. Möbus kept paraphrasing Varg's statements to the German media shortly after Varg made them to the Norwegian press, sometimes even quoting him verbatim. Möbus stole Varg's idea of self-mythologizing through already existing deities too. Hendrik equates himself to Loki, someone who was punished by the gods for their own sins. While he initially fought the fact that Sandro's murder was being portrayed as a ritual sacrifice, claiming that it was divorced from any religion or ideology, he now insists that it was actually a pagan sacrificial rite. He adopted the alias of Jarl Flag Nidhogg. Nidhogg referring to the dragon who gnaws on the roots of the world tree and drinks the blood of corpses in Norse mythology. Just like he shaped his entire life around Varg's persona in Sondershausen, he remodeled his life to fit Varg's abandonment of his satanic Count Grishnak persona and acceptance of pagan and neo-Nazi beliefs. He was copying every move Varg Vikernes took in real time. And as Möbus re-entered the free world in 1998, this behavior would only intensify. Following their release on parole, each of the members of Absurd went off to live completely different lives. Andreas Kirchner left the music scene and cut all contact with Hendrik and Sebastian. He has moved on past the event entirely, working a decent job and living with his girlfriend. Sebastian Schausal started Halgadom, a joint metal project with the band Stahlgewitter. He has devoted himself to paganism too, denying his previous allegiance with Satan. He has a new clique in which he has a similar role to his Sondershausen circle. However, other than making black metal music, he has disconnected himself from the black metal scene fully. Hendrik Möbus, on the other hand, leaned both into the black metal scene and the far-right scene. By this point, Varg Vikernes had already started his Norwegian Heathen Front, a political organization formed with the goal of spreading nationalist and pagan ideology, and was working on setting up the Allgermanische Heidnische Front, its expansion into countries beyond Norway. In 1998, Möbus contributed by establishing the Deutsche Heidnische Front, the German division of the AHF. Other than being based in Germany, his organization was identical to Varg's, promoting all of the same views in all of the same ways. Unlike Varg though, who left the black metal scene when he dove into far-right politics, Möbus sees the two scenes as deeply interconnected. Hendrik, like Varg, believes in a societal collapse that will result in a new heathen state emerging, but he sees the black metal youth as the leaders of said revolution, referring to them as the youth of the new Reich. Describing them as violently active, dominating, intrepid, brutal, insensitive to pain, prideful, independent, strong, heroic, and willing to discard altruism and morality, he sees them as the only way a neo-heathen state can arise. He founded his own black metal label, Darker Than Black Records, and reconnected with his old black metal contacts. Due to Sebastian and Andreas going silent, and Hendrik being more open to interviews than ever before, the media focused on Möbus following Absurd's release from prison. He announced a new album set to release in July of 1999, titled Asgardsrey. With his original lineup gone, he recruited a new set of people, most notably including his brother Ronald Möbus, also known as Wolf. While Sebastian was more focused on his newer projects independent of Möbus, he agreed to provide some vocals for Absurd's return to the black metal scene. Part of the promotional campaign for the album included the phrase, "Order it now before Zog take your copy," Zog being a commonly used Nazi term referring to a Zionist-occupied government. It didn't take long for this warning to be proven true. Unlike the US, Germany does not have freedom of speech or freedom of expression laws. Any expression that the German government considers offensive or hateful can and will result in you being jailed. These laws are most often used to censor Nazi rhetoric, but have been used for milder statements deemed racist or xenophobic too. The things Hendrik was doing definitely fell under the umbrella of the speech the German government censored. Not long after his announcement of Absurd's return, a public prosecutor started a notion to have Möbus's parole revoked. His music and album ads weren't enough to jail Möbus on their own, but the government also brought up instances of Hendrik performing a Roman salute on stage and wearing a swastika patch while performing. So in September of 1999, the courts ruled to have Hendrik's parole revoked and to have him sent back to prison. On the 6th of October the same year, the police raided a number of houses, including the Darker Than Black headquarters, and confiscated any absurd CDs uncovered as hateful material. But those raids did not uncover Möbus himself. The entire purpose of the police assault was to arrest the German Vikernes, but he seemed to have disappeared completely. Sometime in late 1999, after his sentencing and before the police conducted their raids, Möbus flew to Seattle, Washington. He traveled across the US, staying with the far-right contacts he acquired through the DHF. His final destination was in West Virginia, where he arrived at the headquarters of National Alliance, one of the largest white supremacist groups in the US. He met and befriended their founder, William Pierce, and would spend the next period of his life living at his farm. Pierce is a notorious figure. For over 30 years, he was one of the highest profile individuals within the white power movement. He spent decades leading National Alliance, a group whose primary goal was a white nationalist takeover of the United States. At the time of his meeting with Möbus, National Alliance was bringing in over $1 million a year and had over 1,500 members. He famously wrote The Turner Diaries, a novel depicting his organization's main goal, a takeover of the United States through a race war, which leads to the systematic extermination of non-white people worldwide. The book has since been dubbed the Nazi Bible. It influenced a number of terrorist attacks over the years, most infamously being a key influence for Timothy McVeigh, one of the participants in the Oklahoma City bombing plot that killed 168 and injured over 700 people. McVeigh always carried copies of the Turner Diaries anywhere he went, and frequently gave them away to people he met. When Möbus arrived in West Virginia, Pierce already had a record label, Resistance Records. Up until that point, it had focused primarily on skinhead music, but with Hendrik's help, he wanted to expand it into black metal. Pierce saw black metal as a powerful recruitment tool for National Alliance. He already agreed with Hendrik that the black metal youth were a powerful tool to have in the upcoming revolution. They just needed ways of bridging the gap between their love for music and their participation in white power movements. The first step to overcome was the current movements discussed with black metal. Black metal was still widely associated with Satanism, which is something that National Alliance wasn't a huge fan of. To counteract this, Hendrik started writing for several of Pierce's many magazines, under the alias of Hagen von Tronje, attempting to get the white power audience to understand black metal's rebrand from Satanism to paganism. He tried to repeat what Varg successfully achieved in Norway with an American crowd, shifting the public perception of black metal to something that favors white nationalist views more. But before they could complete their mission, Hendrik was arrested in August of 2000 by US federal agents acting on an international warrant. He was to be extradited to Germany to serve the remainder of his sentence. The media caught on to this fast, and he became a media sensation in the US too, with all of the articles on him painting him as an evil neo-Nazi fugitive. However, National Alliance would come to his assistance. They provided legal defense for him, even soliciting donations to help with the legal costs they would incur. Pierce was running a popular right-wing radio show by the name of American Dissident Voices. He had Möbus on and explained his case in detail. They called into question Western free speech and focused on how cases like this can be used to crack down on political dissidents the government deems a threat. An online Free Hendrik Möbus campaign was created to assist him, with Möbus himself frequently writing articles explaining his concerns regarding first world governments regulating thoughts and issuing punishments based on one's speech alone. The online campaign also collected money through selling merch in support of Hendrik. Möbus' campaign then escalated as Hendrik wrote a letter to Bill Clinton and Attorney General Janet Reno, requesting political asylum in the US, correctly stating that extraditing him to Germany would result in him being persecuted based on his political beliefs. The media perspective of the case changed rapidly. Möbus was no longer simply a neo-Nazi fugitive, but a symbol in the battle for free speech. Sending him back to his home country would go against the very idea the United States were founded on. His case became emblematic of the public's concerns over the way seemingly democratic countries deal with the people they deem a threat to democracy. He quickly became a martyr who went against the mold in his thinking and political views. The United States government had an important choice to make. Germany was still pressuring them to send back Hendrik Möbus, but doing so would mean sending him to prison over something that is a constitutionally protected right in the US. Typically, the authorities wouldn't extradite a person based on something that isn't a crime in the country they're currently residing in. Not only was his display of Nazi imagery not a crime in the US, but sending Hendrik to certain doom would set a bad precedent for people being granted political asylum in the future. By declining Möbus' asylum, the US government would make it clear that they are willing to protect ideological prisoners from other countries only in the cases where they are in agreement with the ideology the person is being persecuted for. They would be showing that they are no better than Germany in their treatment of dissidents. Their policies would no longer be about freedom of speech, but rather the perpetuation of regimes the US deems acceptable. Rather than tackling the moral issues at hand, the government decided to send Möbus back on a technicality. They made the argument that by publicly displaying banned symbols, he had breached his parole, as an obvious condition of his parole was not to commit any further crimes. Instead of debating the legitimacy of the actual crime that resulted in the parole breach, they focused on the fact that the concept of a parole breach was a crime under US law. Möbus was extradited, not for the speech crime that he would inevitably receive more time for, but for breaching his parole conditions. So on the 29th of July 2001, Möbus was imprisoned in Germany again, being forced to serve the remainder of his original punishment, as well as an additional 2 years for the public display of prohibited imagery. Some of the statements he gave in interviews, including statements given for a book tackling the history of black metal, Lords of Chaos, were used as evidence in his sentencing. His plans with peers to turn black metal into a tool for propaganda through Resistance Records would be put on hold until his release. Unfortunately for Möbus and peers, these plans would fall through entirely only a year later, due to William Pierce's death in July of 2002. Möbus got to experience the highs and lows of becoming a controversial figure and a media sensation, nearly to the level of his idol, Varg Vikernes. But that resulted in him being forced to spend the following few years locked away, uncertain for what awaited on the other side, now that both his deal with Pierce and his old band stopped existing. While their founder was in hiding and then in prison, Absurd continued without him. The band was now led by Wolf, Hendrik's brother, and featured Sven Unhold Zimpe, who handled the instruments. The rest of the band rotated in and out constantly. Sebastian Schauseil occasionally appeared on the vocals up until 2002. With his abandonment of Absurd, the band continued even after losing all of its original members. They have released many albums since, none of them however reaching anything near the fame brought on by Hendrik's antics. Once Hendrik was finally released from prison in 2007, he immediately reconnected with his old black metal and far-right contacts. He continued running Darker Than Black Records, releasing several albums that have since been added to Germany's Federal Index of Forbidden Records. On the 16th of October 2009, he and his associates were victims of another police raid in Berlin, which resulted in the seizure of 12,000 forbidden records. By January of 2011, Möbus was issued a 10-month suspended sentence for the distribution of his banned records. He spent some time working as a self-described musical journalist. He was behind the controversial black metal magazine Ablaze, and ran a blog titled Enemy of the World. By 2017, Möbus decided to get back into making music himself, rather than just distributing it and writing about it. He recruited a new group of musicians and started Absurd. Their debut came at UBUNGSRAUM, a Ukrainian far-right black metal festival titled after one of Absurd's own albums. The festival has long been accused of existing as a propaganda machine for the Azov Battalion. Möbus continued running a parallel band also called Absurd that performed live and released multiple albums. His Absurd and Wolf's Absurd have a rivalry, with both claiming to be the real Absurd while the other is a fake and a copycat. It's hard to say who's right. Hendrik was one of the 3 founders of the band, but by the time of his reappearance into the music scene, Wolf and Unhold were way more prolific as Absurd, both in terms of releases and live performances, than Hendrik ever was. But despite being vocal about their rivalry, it seems like music is no longer a focus for Hendrik Möbus. Since his release from prison, he has spent most of his time parroting racialist talking points and building a network of like-minded Nazis. He is relatively successful at it too, as he has been connected to seemingly every white supremacist figure and movement in recent history. He appears to see music as purely a money-making venture and a propaganda device, as most of the darker-than-black releases and the music he covered in his publications function primarily as a way of getting the kids interested in far-right ideology. His work with the new Absurd is exactly the same, with their live performances being relegated to political statements rather than being a display of their musicianship. Even though William Pierce was long dead, Hendrik seems to have picked up some of his opinions on the use of music as propaganda, and independently continued his campaign to push black metal further into the extreme until it became a Nazi recruitment tool. But his days in the spotlight are long gone. Hendrik still desperately tries to attract media attention by giving incendiary interviews, lectures on controversial subjects, and attending countless far-right events. But nothing he does has attracted the attention his neo-Nazi refugee status did at the start of the millennium. He got to be the German Varg-Vikernes for a few years, but unlike his idol, he has faded into irrelevance. Even though he is still alive and active, both in the music scene and the political scene, he is spoken about in past tense. The world knows him as one of the men who popularized nationalist socialist black metal. He is the figure who escalated the use of his genre for propaganda, and is one of the key culprits for the current Nazification of black metal. Ironically, he is forgotten as a figure still promoting and perpetuating it to this day. He isn't interviewed anymore, and no conversations around his life include any of his recent actions, with everything following his time with William Pierce effectively being lost history. If we go back to his comparison with Varg-Vikernes, I think the reason his attempts at becoming a media mainstay failed is primarily the fact that he lacked most of Varg's artistry. Varg is able to create some of the best metal music of all time. People who hate everything he stands for still admit that his early albums are masterpieces. Absurd's music would be forgotten if not for Möbus's controversies. Varg is immensely charismatic and has a flair for drama. He knows how to make his scandals interesting to the public looking in, and is likable enough to draw people into his ideology. His controversies are entertaining above all. Möbus is pragmatic. He is a politician that can effectively network with fellow white supremacists, but everything he does seems detestable to people outside of his ideology. Any success that he might have had over the years came from the fact that he was taking tricks out of Varg's playbook, which also ended up resulting in his downfall, as he didn't have any of the skill required to pull them off in the long run. Hendrik Möbus might still be out there roaming the world in the flesh, but the public considers him dead and buried, a relic of past movements and ideas and a footnote in his genre's history, a symbol that was forgotten almost as quickly as it came into existence.